In today's video, I'm going to begin showing you exactly how to integrate materials. I'm going to use a tool that I had used, say, 2 years ago to prepare students for the MBME. Not really USMLE, but MBME for the most part. I think I found it sufficient enough as the fastest way, or one of the fastest way, to review material and at the same time show students how to bring all this information across different organ systems together. Those of you that have been asking how to integrate materials, here you go. These are the videos you should follow. Follow this series. Remember to share it with other students. And let's begin learning medicine. I'll just remind you, what you do after you are done studying, it's more important than what you do when you study. A lot of students think it's all about the studying, but what we are going to begin looking at in this series, I would show you as we go along, is actually more important than the time you spend studying. Those moments when you are by yourself away from the books, the thoughts that you go through, the processing of information you do, is what helps you remember in the long term. And I hope you learn that through this series. And without wasting any more of your time, let's jump right into this video. Go. All right, let's jump right in. The first is abdominal pain, ascites, and hepatomegaly. Abdominal pain, ascites, hepatomegaly. I'm going to go very quickly, so you can either slow down this video or pause the video from time to time. I would like to make these videos as short as possible. Maybe we would only do one at a time per video, I don't know. Or maybe we could have 2 or 3, depending on how long it's going to make the video so that it will be manageable for you. Abdominal pain, ascites, and hepatomegaly. The most common differential students give me is cirrhosis, which is not a bad one, because when people have liver cirrhosis, they are potentially going to have abdominal pain, ascites for sure because of portal hypertension. But how about hepatomegaly? Do they always have hepatomegaly? In the early stages, maybe, but overall, if the liver is getting cirrhosed, is getting fibrosed, it's probably going to shrink. So liver cirrhosis, although good, very close, the best differential here is going to be Budd-Chiari syndrome. Abdominal pain, ascites, and hepatomegaly. The best differential is actually Budd-Chiari syndrome. And then you're going to ask yourself, okay, what's the pathophysiology of Budd-Chiari syndrome? What causes Budd-Chiari syndrome? Or what is Budd-Chiari syndrome, actually? Budd-Chiari syndrome pathophysiology is going to be hepatic venous thrombosis. Hepatic venous thrombosis. You would remember that a diagram like this, if you remember it. We basically have the liver, and we have the portal circulation coming in that way into the liver, and then we have your hepatic vein leaving the liver and going into the inferior vena cava. So right here is the inferior vena cava, and of course the inferior vena cava is going to drain into or return blood into the heart. And somewhere here in this portion of the hepatic vein, this is the hepatic vein, is where the obstruction is. Right here is where the obstruction is. Now, because there's obstruction here, what's going to happen? You're going to have backup of fluid, backup venous blood into the liver. The liver is going to get congestion. So we have hepatic congestion, right? Because blood is backing up. And if there's hepatic congestion, of course, there'll be hepatomegaly. Explains that perfectly. The same blood is going to back up into the portal vein. Why do they have ascites? It backs up into the umbilical arteries, or umbilical veins, rather. And because it backs up into the umbilical veins, they're going to have ascites. Remember what you find on physical examination. On your exam, they may talk about shifting dullness. Now, when you study and you look at symptoms, first aid, for example, some people read first aid and it doesn't make a lot of sense. Now, if you are looking at your first aid is going to tell you ascites. On the exam, they may not use the word ascites, which explains the reason why you study something and then you go back to do questions and the questions don't make sense. The questions are not necessarily going to use the words and the terms that are in your first aid. The question is oftentimes, and many times actually, they're going to break down those words into what they mean or into a physical examination finding. So instead of telling you a patient has ascites, I would tell you a patient has shifting dullness. On physical examination, shifting dullness was observed. If you have memorized ascites and whatever else you've memorized, then you'll be thrown off if you don't know what shifting dullness means. So apart from memorizing symptoms, you want to know the interpretation. What does this mean? on physical exam, what physical exam finding actually describes this symptom you are looking at in this patient. So a patient with ascites on physical examination is going to have shifting dullness. All right, so that is one of the findings we are going to have, and that will explain the ascites. Abdominal pain, stretching. If the liver is getting enlarged, you're going to stretch the peritoneum, and the patient is going to have abdominal pain. Right here, you've given out, or you've understood the symptoms and presentations of Budd-Chiari syndrome. You need to actually understand how the symptoms occur. Why do XYZ symptoms present in XYZ disease? Not just memorize that, okay, Budd-Chiari syndrome. If you read your first aid, there's thrombosis, there's congestion, there's probably necrosis of the liver, and you've memorized it. But when they give you in a vignette form, you don't know what they are talking about in the vignette. You don't understand what the vignette is saying, because although you know a bunch of symptoms, when those symptoms are relayed in English language, you actually don't get what they're describing. So apart from memorizing the symptoms, again, you should master the description of all those symptoms and how those symptoms or those underlying pathologies translate into physical findings. That is the key to knowing how to answer questions and actually interpreting questions on the USMLE. All right, so we have this. Potentially, the liver is congested, there is ascites. Somebody is going to ask, how do you differentiate this from right heart failure? What's the difference between these symptoms I have described, between Budd-Chiari syndrome and right heart failure? Well, because in right heart failure, the liver is going to get congested. And you remember that right heart failure, both right heart failure and Budd-Chiari syndrome, whenever there's liver congestion, the liver has this characteristic nutmeg appearance. I hope you remember that. These are things you should just know. If you know that nutmeg appearance is because of hepatic congestion, then it doesn't matter if it's right heart failure or Budd-Chiari syndrome. If the liver is congested, you expect to see nutmeg appearance or nutmeg liver or mottled appearance, whatever description they give. How would you differentiate right heart failure, however, from Budd-Chiari syndrome? If there is right heart failure, the patient is going to have JVD, jugular venous distension. In Budd-Chiari syndrome, the problem is at the level of the hepatic vein. There's no problem above the hepatic vein. So this patient is not going to have jugular venous distension. The patient is not going to have shortness of breath, in case you're thinking there's just general heart failure, including left heart, right heart, whatever. None of those things are going to occur. It's just going to be strictly these presentations we've dealt with here. The next question you're going to be asking yourself is, what are the causes of Budd-Chiari syndrome? What are the causes of Budd-Chiari syndrome? One of the very common ones is going to be Polycythemia Vera. I think we should just go to the next page. One of the very common ones is Polycythemia Vera. And then you're going to begin to ask yourself, okay, Polycythemia Vera is a common cause. What's the pathophysiology of Polycythemia Vera? Polycythemia Vera is due to a mutation in JAK2 gene. It's JAK2 gene mutation. You want to remember that Polycythemia Vera is a stem cell defect. It's a problem, and this is an MBME question, so you have to know this. It's a problem at the level of the stem cells. That is why when there is Polycythemia Vera, you have not just increase in red blood cell count, you also have an increase in maybe basophils, increase in platelets, because the stem cells, remember, are destined to be almost anything. So more than likely, hematopoietic stem cells. So more than likely, they will become a variety of cells, and all of those cells will have an increase in number, but especially the red blood cells, Because there is increase in basophils, these basophils are going to release histamine and all of those content, and this will result in itching. So this patient is going to have itching, especially after a warm bath. So you may be reading a vignette and they tell you the patient had itching following warm baths, and you're thinking, what does that even mean? That's a symptom that a patient with Polycythemia Vera is going to have. Because the red blood cells are so high, they're going to have increased viscosity. The blood is too thick, basically. And because the blood is too thick, there's going to be hypercoagulability, right? There's going to be hypercoagulability. It's easy to obstruct blood vessels. And if you obstruct blood vessels, muscles and different parts of the body, tissues will not receive oxygen supply, which is hypoxia, you would remember. If you have hypoxia, your tissues are not receiving blood supply. What do you experience? Pain. Also, because there's increased red blood cells, these patients are going to appear reddish. So a patient with polycythemia vera is going to have increased red blood cell count. Because he has increased red blood cell count, he's going to look reddish. Remember, it's not just red blood cell, it's a lot of red blood cell. It's like a lot of blood, technically. He's going to look reddish. So there's erythro, reddish appearance. 1 second. Okay. And he's going to be in pain, melalgia, erythromelalgia. He looks very reddish and he's in pain, extremity pains, for example. So that becomes one of the symptoms and one of the findings you're going to have in patients with polycythemia vera. You're going to be asking yourself, how do we treat polycythemia vera? If you're going to treat, because if polycythemia vera is the cause of Budd-Chiari syndrome, one of the things you want to do is to treat the underlying cause. Polycythemia vera, how would you treat? The one very simple one is phlebotomy, or in old times, we talk about bloodletting, basically let them lose some blood because the problem is that they have too much blood. And then we can think about medications like hydroxyurea. These are concepts you would see on your exam. If you're doing step 2 CK, you're going to need to know when to do what exactly. So if it's acute, and sometimes on step 1 as well, if it's someone is presenting right now with maybe acute symptoms, related to polycythemia vera, maybe you need to do phlebotomy immediately. Imagine as a matter of urgency or emergency. And then we talk about hydroxyurea. Hydroxyurea, you would remember from your biochemistry that hydroxyurea inhibited a pathway in pyrimidine synthesis. Take a moment. Do you remember the mechanism of action of hydroxyurea? Now, of course, I know it's very easy. A lot of you will be thinking to increase hemoglobin F in sickle cell disease. That is one. The other mechanism of hydroxyurea in the pyrimidine synthesis pathway, do you remember that? Do you remember that hydroxyurea inhibits ribonucleotide reductase? Ribonucleotide reductase. Hydroxyurea inhibits ribonucleotide reductase. And by so doing, it's inhibiting pyrimidine synthesis. Now, what you want to be thinking to yourself is, we started this session talking about abdominal appendicitis, hepatomegaly, Budd-Chiari syndrome. That is gastrointestinal system. A lot of you would ask, what is integration? How do you integrate material? This is one aspect of integration. And in fact, what I'm doing right now, as I told you guys before, is exactly how I prepared people for NBME, say 2 years ago, 3 years ago. NBMEs, not necessarily USMLEs, but for the NBME, this was a sufficient approach to take for the most part. Now, we have abdominal appendicitis, hepatomegaly. We came up with Budd-Chiari syndrome. We talked a bit about Budd-Chiari syndrome. And then what we did is find a connection between Budd-Chiari syndrome. We've started talking about polycythemia vera. Polycythemia vera is a hematology concept. If you've noticed, it's hematology. And right here, you see a connection between gastroenterology and hematology. This is a connection, one connection between a gastroenterology concept and hematology. There are a lot of connections, and as we go through this series, you're going to see a whole lot of them. We'll talk about when people have heart failure and they develop mesenteric ischemia. Do you see the connection between cardiovascular system and gastroenterology in that picture? And right here, we talk about hydroxyurea. Hydroxyurea inhibits ribonucleotide reductase, an enzyme in pyrimidine synthesis pathway. Are you seeing a connection between hematology, gastroenterology, and now biochemistry? And now biochemistry. All right, we'll just go ahead because we don't have all the time. But I hope you're going to practice this at your own time. Straight up, hydroxyurea is going to inhibit pyrimidine synthesis by blocking ribonucleotide reductase. And you may remember that ribonucleotide reductase was the enzyme that converted, I think UDP, it was the enzyme that converted UDP to DUDP. I've started forgetting. And then DUDP became DUMP, and DUMP became DTMP. I hope you remember this pathway. Ribonucleotide reductase specifically was working at this juncture on this pathway. And that is where hydroxyurea inhibits. And just as an aside, do you remember the medications or the enzyme, first of all, that worked at this last step? If you said what's the name? Thymidylate synthase, you would be correct. Thymidylate synthase. You may remember that thymidylate synthase is the enzyme on that pathway. And do you remember the medications that inhibited thymidylate synthase? Do you remember the medications that inhibited thymidylate synthase? You would be thinking methotrexate, right? Trimethoprim, and what's the last one? Oh no, that is a bad mistake. Sorry, not methotrexate. You see, when I think of these things by myself, I make mistakes as well. The enzyme that inhibits thymidylate synthase is 5-fluorouracil. I'm very sorry for that mistake. 5-fluorouracil. But now, this is just to tell you that when you reflect on these things, you're going to be making mistakes, just like I've made here. In my case, at least I know it's a mistake. When you go through these processes, it's a reflective session for you. You make mistakes, you go back to your first aid, you look it up, you make sure of what it was, and then you fix it and you move on from there. That is how you improve. What you do after you are done studying is much more important than the studying you did itself. Always remember that. Remember, concerning the error I made the last time, right here we had an enzyme. Well, is it an enzyme? A vitamin that acted to help thymidylate synthase activity. Vitamin B9, different forms, N5, N10, different forms of vitamin B9 playing a role in that step. Do you remember the medications that inhibited that pathway? Do you remember the enzymes or the medications that blocked B9 synthesis and prevent thymidylate synthase activity? Now that's where we have methotrexate, trimethoprim, and I think pyrimethamine. I always forget pyrimethamine, so you want to remember pyrimethamine. Again, you have done a bit of GI review, a bit of hematology review, and we've talked some biochemistry. Now, a number of things I would like you to know that if I would, you would probably need to think about as well while you are at this. In Budd-Chiari syndrome, of course, there is thrombus formation. Do you remember the triad for hypercoagulability? The triad for hypercoagulability. Do you remember what it's called? If you're thinking Vaca's triad, you're correct. Vaca's triad. Do you remember the components of Vaca's triad? What are the components of Vaca's triad? All right, you'll be thinking endothelial injury. You'll be thinking stasis. You'll be thinking hypercoagulability. Endothelial injury, stasis, and hypercoagulability. You'd remember an example of stasis is going to be people with atrial fibrillation. Why do people with atrial fibrillation form clots? Because of stasis. Why do people with cancer get thrombus formation? Because cancers, especially adenocarcinomas, induce a hypercoagulable state, meaning that people with cancers, for example, adenocarcinomas, can develop Budd-Chiari syndrome. Pregnancy is a hypercoagulable state. So pregnancy can result in Budd-Chiari syndrome as well. This is how you think of all of these things, right? Pregnancy could result potentially in Budd-Chiari syndrome. Paroxysmal nocturnal hemoglobinuria can also result in Budd-Chiari syndrome. And then you're going to be asking yourself, okay, paroxysmal nocturnal hemoglobinuria, what is that about? You'd remember that in PNH, again, just like Budd-Chiari syndrome, we have a stem cell mutation. We have complement destroying the red blood cell. Why? What is the pathophysiology of paroxysmal nocturnal hemoglobinuria? You'll be thinking to yourself, okay, there's a PIGA gene mutation. And if you don't remember, that's okay. This is the time to go back to the first aid and look it up, and then continue your thought process. Finally, I'll just mention something before we move on. JAK2 gene, we mentioned that JAK2 gene mutation was what caused polycythemia vera. You see, as I talk
thoughts come to my head as I'm thinking about it, the more I dwell on these things, the more ideas I get, the more the brain tries to find all this information from different parts of your brain. We can treat polycythemia vera by inhibiting the JAK2 gene. What if we could block it? Do you remember what the medication was? Ruxolitinib. The medication was ruxolitinib. So you want to remember that. All of these things are very important as you study. All of these things are very important as you study. If you finish reading and you just close the book and you move on with your life, you will not remember stuff. You will forget a lot. After you have studied, and the more organ systems you study, you want to sit down and do a review like this one. This is what integration is. This is the first of its kind we are doing. We are going to have more of this, and we are going to continue from here. Once again, notice that you have talked about Budd-Chiari syndrome. You have seen the connection between Budd-Chiari syndrome and polycythemia vera, hematology, GI hematology. You've seen how this connects to biochemistry. Now, many times on the exam, they are going to give you a question. The vignette will look like gastroenterology, but the option sets, you read the question, it looked like you understood what the question is saying, but when you go to the options, it's like, okay, what's going on here? Many times it's because you are unable to find this connection between these systems, and that is what the examiners are often looking for. Are you able to find the connection between the organ systems? Remember, the human being is a whole individual. Human beings are not cardiovascular system. Human beings are not gastroenterology. So if you're going to be able to manage a patient properly or think about pathology as a whole, pathophysiology, it's important that you are able to establish these connections. All right. If you have any questions, please put them down in the comments. Remember to like this video, subscribe to the channel. Many more questions coming for you. And I'm going to give you a clue what the second one is going to be, so you can go study and prepare for it. And here you go: abdominal pain, diarrhea, leukocytosis following recent antibiotics use. Can you sit down and create a chart like the one we've just done for these differentials? If you can do that, that would be great. You can send it to me. I would like to see it. I would like to hear how you make progress. And until next time, I'll see you guys soon.